Hi guys, welcome to your Macromolecules Basics. So in this video, we're going to go over all the basic structures, functions, building blocks of the four major macromolecules. So first we need to talk about carbon though. So what makes carbon so special? Carbon is the essential component of all of the major macromolecules, and it can be in three major shapes. So you see straight chain molecules, branched molecules, and then ringed molecules. So let's talk about the term macromolecule. So the prefix macro means large. So they are giant molecules made up of hundreds or thousands of smaller units, which are called monomers. These monomers are going to link together to form polymers, and polymers make up macromolecules. So here's to put it in a little bit of perspective for you. So if we take a carbon atom plus a carbon atom, we get a carbon molecule. If we take two carbon molecules, we get a carbon macromolecule, which is made of all those monomers. And then remember, polymers are repeating units of identical compounds, such as many, many, many carbon monomers. And we'll talk about examples of these as we go. So to put it all together in terms of size, so atom is the smallest, which is smaller than a monomer. But a monomer is smaller than a polymer, and a polymer is smaller than a macromolecule. So an entire chain like this is a polymer, and an even larger chain is a macromolecule. So like we said, polymers are made of chains of smaller compounds. So polymers are constantly being put together and taken apart by our bodies. When they're put together through a process called dehydration synthesis. So when you think of the term dehydration, right? You're thirsty. Maybe it's hot outside. You've been working out. You've been at practice. So dehydration is you're losing water. So in dehydration synthesis, water is removed to make this process happen. So this means that two polymers are put together and you get an OH off of one and an H off of the other, and that combines to make water. From the opposite then is the breakdown of organic compounds. So you do this all the time, right? When you eat, you're eating macromolecules, you're not eating monomers. So when you eat those macromolecules, your body has to break it down, meaning that water has to be added. So it's very important as well for you as a person to stay hydrated, because this is how you help your digestion process. And this process is called hydrolysis. So hydro, think water, it's added to make this process happen. So like I had mentioned, we're going to talk about macromolecules in a little more detail. So there are four types of macromolecules, and all of them, like I said, are based on the element carbon. And they may include any combination of these other five essential elements you see. So hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. So the four we're going to talk about in this order is carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Let's talk about carbohydrates first. So the essential elements of carbohydrates are carbon and hydrogen and oxygen. This is probably going to be the macromolecule that you're most familiar with. So the building block of a carbohydrate is a monosaccharide. Mono meaning one. So it's a simple sugar or a single sugar. And the function of carbohydrates in general is to produce energy. They can also be used for storage of energy, especially if they're complex carbs. So if you're someone that is a swimmer, or you're a racer, you know about carb loading, right? So you eat complex carbs and your body stores them for energy in the future, like during a race. So some examples of carbohydrates in general: glucose, lactose, which is the sugar that's in milk, cellulose, starch, grains, pasta, veggies, and fruits are all examples of carbohydrates. Let's break it down then into the different types of carbs. So first up is monosaccharides. Like I had mentioned, mono meaning just one. So these are common sugars such as glucose, fructose, and galactose. And foods that have monosaccharides are things like fruits, vegetables, and honey. Also meaning these are very quick sugars. So if you eat something that's a monosaccharide, your body's going to break it down very quickly, and as a result, you'll get a very quick boost of energy. Disaccharides are a little bit larger, and it's di meaning two. This time, it's two sugars linked together. So these common sugars are things like lactose, sucrose, and maltose, and they're in a little bit more closer to a complex carb. So like wheat, rye, and some veggies like onions and broccoli. And if you look here, here's an example. So the pink and the orange part are combined to make one disaccharide. So that is bonded with this oxygen that you see there. Last up is polysaccharides. The prefix poly meaning many. So these are common sugars like starch, cellulose, glycogen. These are those things that you're going to carb load with for energy in the future, like rice, pasta, potatoes, corn. And if we look here, here's just an example of what a polysaccharide looks like, which is actually this picture down here. This, where my arrow is pointing, is just a small look at how large that molecule actually is. And here's just comparing the two. So as we said, mono is 1, di is 2, and poly is many. Now let's talk about lipids. So lipids are typically associated with fats. So these also have carbon and hydrogen, and sometimes they have oxygen. Their building block, it's debatable whether they have a true building block, but we're going to use fatty acid chains and glycerol as the building block of lipids. So the function of lipids is to store energy as well, but for also insulation and protection. If you think about your body, you have fats in areas where you have very vital organs. So your stomach is protecting your reproductive organs. You have fats that are around your upper parts of your body protecting your vital organs. So we have fats for a reason. Some examples. So of course, fats in foods, but also oils, and then waxes and steroids are also examples of fats. Now you may have heard of saturated and unsaturated fats, especially if you're someone that looks at food labels. Saturated fats are animal fats, and these are the ones that are bad for you, typically, and they're solid at room temperature. Unsaturated fats are things like plant oils. These are liquid at room temperature. So when you think about bacon versus olive oil, if you set them both on the counter and let them get room temperature, the fatty part of the bacon isn't going to melt down to a liquid. It still stays a solid. So that's how you know it's an animal fat. All right, so a little bit more detail. So saturated, like we said, is solid at room temperature, and these are solid animal fats. Now we're going to look a little bit at this picture here just to give you an idea of the structural representation. So there is the maximum number of hydrogen bonds, meaning there's no double bonds. It's just a straight chain. You see all those H's all throughout, all the way around. That gives us that straight chain fatty acid. Unsaturated then has at least one double bond. And in our picture here, we see 1, 2, 3, and then this one doesn't count as part of the structure. So 3 double bonds, meaning it's an unsaturated fat. Saturated means maximum number of hydrogen bonds then. So unsaturated means if you broke those double bonds, you could still add more hydrogen. And like we said, these are liquid, and they're things like plant oils. So here's a little bit more if you look at your food, right? So when you look at a food label, you see the saturated fat, and then you see polyunsaturated and monounsaturated. So mono, meaning, once again, 1, is 1 double bond. So there's only 1 double bond. Polyunsaturated means multiple double bonds. So if we go back to this slide, right, this would be a polyunsaturated fat. So even within unsaturated fats, there's still ones that are healthier for you than others. So polyunsaturated are typically regarded as the healthiest fats for you. So these are the things that you find in fish and nuts. They have omega-3, DHA, and omega-6s in them. Now monounsaturated does have omega-9s as well. Nuts, avocado, poultry. It's all good fat for you. It's much better than other fats that are saturated. Now on to protein. So if you're into fitness at all, you know that protein is important. So the function then, of course, is structure and support. Imagine your bones, your arms and your legs, if you didn't have any muscle on your body. That would be horrible, right? You couldn't use them, they wouldn't move very well, it'd be really hard for you. So, of course, our proteins are very important for our body support. The building block of proteins is amino acids, and these have carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, like the fats and the carbs, but they also have nitrogen and sometimes sulfur, depending on the amino acid. So examples of proteins are things like meats, nuts, eggs, enzymes, veggies. These are all excellent ways of getting protein in your diet. So here's a look at the different amino acids. We will get into amino acids much more in a later unit when we talk about protein synthesis, but for now, here's just a quick peek. So there's 20 different amino acids that are important to comprise proteins, but our bodies can only make 10 of these 20. So we have to get 10 other amino acids from our food. So it's very important that you have protein in your diet. And the final macromolecule that we're going to talk about is nucleic acids. So once again, we see that carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen that everybody has, but nucleic acids also have nitrogen and phosphorus, and their building block is something called a nucleotide. So we'll also discuss nucleotides further when we start talking about DNA, and you'll learn how those are made, because there's even smaller structures that build up the nucleotides. Then the function, of course, everyone knows what DNA does, right? So we store and transmit genetic information. And some examples, of course, DNA, but then also RNA. And it's important to think too, we talk a lot about macromolecules in our food. Nucleic acids aren't listed on food labels, right? Well, the reason for that being is nucleic acids are in everything. If you're eating something that used to once be alive, there's some form of its DNA in that food item. So you're always eating DNA of other organisms, which is kind of weird when you break it down like that, but you're always eating it. And it doesn't necessarily have a nutritional value, so that's why it's not listed on food labels, but it's important for you to know that you are consuming DNA or nucleic acids. And here's just another little infographic to kind of show you the breakdown. So we have carbs. The monomer, of course, is sugar. Functions, store energy, some structural, and an example, a potato. Lipids. This is their structure. The monomer is a fatty acid. They store energy, steroids, membranes, and things like fat cells. Proteins. The monomer is an amino acid, and these are important for enzymes, which we'll talk about in much more detail, and that is really, really important for your body, as well as structural material. And things like hair is made of protein. And finally, nucleic acids. Building block is nucleotide. We know it has our genetic info and things like DNA. And that is all for your notes.